Hello, this is Neil Hansen. I'm one of the diagnostic radiologists at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, and I'm doing an online physics lecture called Ultrasound Part 2 Basic Ultrasound Imaging and Display. This is a lecture designed for preparation for the core exam for radiology residents. I have a corresponding quiz which you can take on Poll Everywhere, which every about 5 minutes there's a question for you to consider and answer. If you're a person that likes to answer questions and actually physically put the answer in during the talk, feel free to go to this link. For my own personal residents, I would ask you to go to this link, put your name in so that I know you have completed this module. This is considered credit for or proof of that you've completed this module. Also, I will stop, pause at the end of every question so that you can take more time to answer it if you need to. But go ahead and feel free to pause the video yourself if you need more time. All right, this is for if I did it live or when I do this lecture live. References. So much of the content is based off of the publicly available RSNA physics modules for radiology residents. This one highlights things from basic ultrasound imaging and display. There's a review book by Huda, which this material is covered in chapter 10. There's also a Bushberg textbooks on medical physics imaging. This is covered in chapter 14. Additionally, there's lots of other online references and radiographics articles. I cite some of them, and here I use some of their illustrations and highlights. All of it was freely available publicly on the web, and I am not receiving any money for this. It's for educational purposes only. Here's our outline today. We're going to talk about how images are formed, image quality, image optimization for ultrasound, and then we'll go into some basics of Doppler imaging. This is the moment when I realize I did not refresh and eliminate all the questions from the last time I gave this talk, and I'm an idiot. God damn it. So I'm going to pause the video here real quick. And we're back. So the velocity of a 3 megahertz sound beam is slowest in, correct answer is air. All right, ultrasound. So ultrasound machines are kind of intimidating at first when you go in to use them, be it to scan someone yourself for the first time or to use them for an interventional procedure. So you should be aware of the basics of them. They all have an image display monitor. They usually have several transducers. Oftentimes to the right aspect of the machine will be the transducer which is plugged in and you're using currently. However, there will be several transducer connectors usually under the keyboard. You have a workstation. There's a control panel with all the various imaging parameters which you can manipulate to make the picture look pretty. For intraoperative ultrasound, oftentimes there'll be a setup which you can use for putting a sterile probe cover on, as well as some other niche products for specific or more targeted ultrasound transducer setups. The block diagram of what's actually inside this thing I think is useful to look at. You have a transducer, which is the beam former. You have a transmitter, which is a beam former. You have a receiver and amplifying and processing. So basically, the ultrasound transducer both sends the beam out and transmits it back and listens to it. And then it goes into a computer where it receives that electronic signal, which is made from the piezoelectric crystal being deformed via changes in pressure and changing that into an electrical impulse. And via a bunch of computer magic, all of that electrical impulse is turned into a picture, which then can be displayed on a monitor or sent out on a hard copy disk somewhere. The anatomy of a transducer, to review from last time, consists of a lens, which is oftentimes used to focus the sonographic beam coming out into the person, a matching or damping layer, here's the damping layer, and then the piezoelectric crystal, which actually does the functional portion of imaging in terms of generating the pressure disturbance and also the electrical impulse in the echoes or pressure disturbances which return to the transducer. Here's a multi-element array transducer where there's lots of these little setups, maybe 96, maybe 256, something like that, versus a more simplified single element array transducer. All right, so again, the ultrasound probe has a crystal in it. When exposed to electricity, the crystal generates a pressure disturbance, or when put in the setting of a pressure disturbance, i.e. a sound wave coming back, it will generate an electrical impulse. I went over this last time, but basically this transducer is used in pulse mode, so it will both send out a pressure disturbance into the soft tissues of the patient, and it will receive that echo back and change it into an electrical impulse, which is then turned into the image. When sound goes into the body, it can be attenuated, absorbed, scattered, refracted, diffracted. We discussed many of these last time. Specifically, we went over reflection, and here's Snell's law allowing you to calculate, refraction. Snell's law, which allows you to calculate the amount of refraction based off of velocities, or alternatively, the velocities based off of the degree of refraction. Here's your question. Reflections are least likely to occur from which of the following? The correct answer is bladder contents. So kind of a review of last time, but bladder contents are nearly pure fluid, which propagates sound beams very well, and so it wouldn't necessarily be expected to reflect them back. All right, acoustic impedance is best displayed as which of the following? The unit is the Radial. The correct answer is density times sound velocity. So Z, the acoustic impedance, equals the density times the sound velocity. This is just a little bit of a review from last time. Acoustic impedance is the relative opposition of a medium to the transmission of longitudinal sound waves. It's independent of the frequency, and the key difference is that differences in acoustic impedances at tissue interfaces determine how much energy is reflected. All right. That was kind of the review of what historically people have struggled with from the first lecture. So how is a picture made? Well, sound is emitted, then the transducer listens for an echo to come back. Emit a sound, wait, listen for sound. This assumes, or most transducers assume, the soft tissue velocity of sound is 1540 meters per second, which means it's going really fast. That's 1 centimeter in 13 microseconds. The time of echo reflection is used to calculate the depth of where that echo came from. And the strength or intensity of the echo provides information on the acoustic impedances of tissue. And then via computer magic, this intensity of echo reflection is turned into a 512 by 512 matrix and displayed in real time on a screen. So all of that goes into us seeing the liver here. And there's a lot that goes into making this look pretty. If you think about it, we have to manipulate things because the echo down here will be more attenuated and scattered than the echo coming back from up here. There are things which you can manipulate to make that look better. There are things you can manipulate to specifically image a structure. Say you wanted to look at potential thrombus in this hepatic vein here. Lots of different ways we can manipulate this image. Before we can talk about image manipulation, we have to go over ultrasound mode. So the correct answer is in diagnostic radiology, we're usually using B mode. But first we'll go over A mode or amplitude mode. We don't use this very often in diagnostic radiology. It's where the sonographic machine plots the depth on the horizontal axis versus the echo intensity or the pulse amplitude on the vertical axis. Clinically, this is used in ophthalmology to measure lens and do lens measurement calculations. We really don't do that much within our realm of diagnostic imaging for radiology, though. M mode is motion or time motion mode. It's time on the horizontal axis versus depth on the vertical axis, and the echo intensity is represented as a given brightness. So the brighter the object on the screen, the more intense the echo coming back. This displays time-dependent motion well. And again, we don't really use M mode that much in radiology, but in cardiology for heart echocardiography, looking at cardiac valve motion is an example of M mode ultrasound used frequently in that application. You can determine velocity of moving structures, and if you know the velocity across like a heart valve, you can calculate cross-sectional area and estimate hypertension, speeds, stenoses, that kind of thing. B mode, so brightness mode. This is where radiologists kind of live most of the time. Here's an example of a B mode image of the kidney. Echo intensity is displayed as brightness along each line of sight, and the echo timing determines the depth or position of the display on the image. Obviously, this is the most common mode we use. A typical frame rate, or how many frames are appearing on the screen per second, is around 20 or 30 frames per second. That's really as good as the human eye can see in general, as good as like an old school movie type of picture frame rate, and so it works quite well. It allows us to do real-time visualization for things like biopsy guidance, needle placement, etc. Harmonic imaging. So harmonic imaging would be most likely used in which clinical scenario? Well, the correct answer is to evaluate a breast cyst or a mass. So harmonic imaging is a mode in ultrasound. Again, we're going over sonographic modes, where the harmonic frequencies, which are integral multiples of the fundamental pulse frequency, are specifically imaged. For example, a high frequency harmonic is twice the fundamental frequency. You can have one that's 3 times the fundamental frequency, 4 times the fundamental frequency, etc. This is a graphical representation of the fundamental frequency, the first harmonic, second harmonic, etc. This results, or these harmonic waves, results from nonlinear tissue interactions, and you can set your receiver to specifically hone in on these harmonic waves alone. It can remove clutter, it can remove noise. And for example, the most commonly used harmonic is the first one, which is 2 times the fundamental frequency, and we can specifically put on harmonic imaging to eliminate clutter and noise and get a better image. Commonly, this is used to prove something is a cyst clinically, so something that's a noisy environment. So let's say you have breast ultrasound. You can't tell if something's a hypoechoic mass or a benign simple cyst. You can put on harmonics and try and prove one way or the other. Here's an example of a fetal echocardiogram. So here, and you can tell harmonics are on by looking here at the frequency and telling that this little h means harmonics. So we're looking at harmonics of 4 megahertz. And if you look at the heart here, a fluid-filled structure filled with blood, of course, it looks kind of hypoechoic but kind of gray and hazy, versus when we put on harmonic imaging over the fetus, this turns essentially completely anechoic, completely black, and we know that it's filled with fluid. Here's an example of a breast ultrasound. So there are these low-level gray echoes here at the fundamental frequency. You might be wondering, is this a hypoechoic fibroadenoma or a solid mass? You put on harmonics, and we prove that it's actually just a cyst with increased through transmission. So that's a very useful or a common way to use harmonic imaging. Here's a cluster of microcysts, which again, if you look at the harmonics portion, they look anechoic. Here you might mistake this for a multilobulated hypoechoic mass. Here's a final image of harmonic imaging. This is a kidney cyst. If you look here, you might think this is a hypoechoic mass. Here you can make out the internal contents of the cyst. It's complex. They didn't completely go away, so it's not a simple cyst. And in fact, this could be a cystic renal cell malignancy, but really you have much more confidence in looking at this image than this one with the fundamental frequency alone. Compound imaging. So compound imaging, conventional imaging uses sound beams that are perpendicular to the probe, versus compound imaging, when done in real time, sound is actually steered at multiple angles, and the computer magically averages signals from all different directions. This can accentuate high-level reflectors, and it can eliminate weak reflectors, which tend to just contribute to noise in the image. This really works out well in noisy tissues, and the example I like to cite is a fatty liver. It can make a hepatic steatosis cause a lot of noise and scatter, and it can make it very difficult to see lesions within the liver, like liver metastases or hepatocellular carcinoma, primary liver tumors. So if a very fatty liver is present, oftentimes a sonographer will employ compound imaging to get a better look. Here's an example of a liver hemangioma. Here is the regular imaging. Here's with compound imaging on, and you can see the outline of that echogenic hemangioma liver mass much better with compound imaging on. Here's an extended field of view. So this is a high resolution linear array transducer with a, most of them are rectangular and they have a very limited field of view. If it's 5 centimeters, that's all you can look at is 5 centimeters. Well, we look at masses, we look at fluid collections, we look at hematomas all the time that are much larger than that, and it makes it very difficult to track them serially to make sure they're going away or getting smaller. So what you can do is you can put echo tracking on in real time that creates a panoramic image, just like on your phone where you're doing a panoramic image of the lovely beach that you're staying on any given afternoon. You can create a panoramic image of, for example, a subcutaneous hematoma, so you can serially follow it and make sure it gets smaller. Another ultrasound mode is 3D imaging. Here's where the scanner takes a stack of 2D images, renders them as a volume, and then gives you a surface anatomy picture in 3 dimensions. Great examples of using this is in fetal sonography via looking at, say, the fetal heart or possibly the maxillofacial structures, looking for cleft lips and palates. Can be a very powerful tool. Now that we've looked at things that are quasi-interesting, we're going to look at boring stuff like physics basic parameters of sonographic images. So what's the main determinant of axial resolution for ultrasound? It's the transducer frequency. That's the correct answer. So axial resolution is the ability to separate 2 objects lying along the axis of the beam. The most important factor is the sound pulse length. So remember, length and frequency are directly related, or rather indirectly related, I guess. So the sound pulse length determines your axial resolution. So axial resolution is 1/2 the pulse length. 2 megahertz or a 2 millimeter pulse length gives you an axial resolution of about a millimeter. For 4 megahertz, your axial resolution would be about 0.5 millimeters. So if you think about it, the higher the frequency transducer, the better your resolution. And this axial resolution is basically your ability to identify something that's superficial from something that's deeper. If you have a low frequency transducer, you might not be able to tell the 2 objects apart. Switch it to a high frequency, higher resolution transducer, and you can definitely tell that they are separate from one another. The trade-off is that those high-frequency transducers, again, have poor penetration, and so you're limited in the depth at which you can use them. No, don't just put in the dictation whatever the sonographer said. Think for yourself. Although, I'll be honest, this got me through a couple difficult early calls when I was a resident. So the correct answer for the main determinant of lateral resolution for an ultrasound is the beam width. All right, lateral resolution. It's the ability to resolve 2 adjacent objects to the left or right of one another, not superficial to deep. So it's determined by the ultrasound beam width. So a focused transducer has a very narrow beam width to improve lateral resolution. Usually it's 4 times worse than axial resolution, even in the best setup, however. So your ability to distinguish 2 lateral objects apart from 2 axial objects is kind of quite limited. You can improve lateral resolution by adjusting your focal position, which we'll get into in a little bit. But lateral resolution in general worsens significantly as you get farther away from the transducer. Here's an example of a phantom which physicists use to determine axial and lateral resolution, looking at distinguishing these dots. Part of a QC check for a new ultrasound probe setup. Here's a mental health break. Feel free to pause. Go get yourself some Cheetos. Get yourself a bathroom break. Maybe pop an energy drink. You can go ahead and pause and take a little break. I put them in these talks. Usually I try and do something funny, but I realize that most of you probably just want to power through this at this point in time, and I would just do that. If you really want, you can YouTube Army Fail or Fail Army. It's one of my favorite things to look at. Image optimization. So now that we've talked about different modes of ultrasound and some of the different physical properties of the sonographic image, we're going to go through all these different ways that you can optimize an image. Frequency. So again, we've hammered this to death, right? It's dead. Stop talking about it. Well, this is probably highly likely to be tested because it's really basic, and it would be very embarrassing if you missed this on your core exam, so I'm going to hammer it home one more time. High frequency transducers, thin, good resolution, poor penetration, 7 to 12 megahertz. Low frequency transducers, thicker, better, penetrating, poorer in terms of resolution. High frequency, linear, lower frequency, better penetrating, general abdomen work. This is specific, more superficial work. PRF is the pulse repetition frequency. It's the number of pulses per second, also known as the pulse rate. Common PRF values are around 4,000 pulses per second. So that's how many times every second sound wave comes back and then the listening occurs. The listening obviously occurs in between those pulses. The choice of PRF determines the penetration depth or the range that the ultrasound can detect. So it's a product of your lines per frame and the frame rate. So if you look at a pulse repetition frequency of 4 kilohertz, that gives you an echo listening time of 250 microseconds, and your depth is 20 centimeters. If you go up higher in frequency, then your echo listening time goes down because you're sending out more samples, so you have less time to listen. And it's kind of like having kids. The more you get, the less time I listen. At least that's what my wife says. And then your penetration depth is actually going down. So as your PRF goes up, your ability to penetrate into the body goes down. Image optimization, power output. At high levels, ultrasound can affect tissues, so the power output has to be limited. In general, the scanner is pre-programmed to deliver maximum safe power output. So you don't really have to think about this. Even for things like early OB fetal imaging, inherently diagnostic imaging is set up to have a safe power output. The machine does it for you. It's displayed in terms of decibels. My Jeopardy song. I accidentally clicked it and it went off. Let's go back and do it again because really it's my favorite thing. So. Depth gain compensation, or some people just call it gain, accounts for tissue attenuation by increasing the echo amplification. So image optimization, the gain, this is that set of dials along usually the right aspect of the keyboard that the sonographer magically waves their hand up and down with and optimizes an image. The deeper an ultrasound beam goes, the more of it is attenuated by absorption and scatter. So uncorrected echo data shows distant echoes to be much weaker than superficial ones, even though it may be a stronger reflector at that deeper surface. So scanners can compensate for this by depth gain compensation. They amplify up the sound that takes a longer time to get back to make the image look uniform from superficial to deep. These knobs are what I was talking about, and you don't need much gain superficially, and you need a lot of gain deeper to create a uniform image. So the DGC is also known as the time gain compensation, time varied gain, and swept gain. Obviously, everything in medicine has to be super freaking hard and have 8 names. So the computer increases artificially assigned signal gain based off of that echo return time and estimated depth. We can control this. This is an example of a poorly executed image where everything is just too bright If you put on depth gain compensation and you get a more uniform image where everything is at a lower intensity level, you can see there's an echogenic liver mass. So when you're going to biopsy a mass that was found on CT and you do an ultrasound and you can't see it, it's probably because you have the parameters for your sonographic imaging set up to a lesser advantage. Image optimization, the focal zone. So the concept of a near and far field in ultrasound imaging is important. The near field is the region used for ultrasound imaging adjacent to the transducer. In fancy physics land, it's known as the Fresnel zone. You can define this as the radius squared divided by the wavelength, where the radius here is just the transducer radius. If you double that transducer size, it's going to increase your near field by a factor of 4, so that because of that r squared property here. The far field obviously starts where the near field ends. That's where the ultrasound beam diverges. It doesn't provide any information at all. It's known as the Fraunhofer zone. An ultrasound near field is made longer when increasing the transducer. Which of the following? The correct answer is the frequency. So the near field is inversely proportional to the wavelength, and it directly relates to the frequency. Focal zone. So all diagnostic ultrasound machines use focusing. Curved piezoelectric crystal or a focusing lens is used. The focal zone is the area where the beam is focused, obviously. It can be manipulated. And if you're doing a biopsy, you want to focus on that mass that you're sampling, right? Because that's how you'll get the best image of that local environment, making sure your needle goes into the right spot. Here's an example again of that echogenic liver mass where the focal zone is set deep. You can get a much better idea of the borders and the interface between the normal liver and the abnormal echogenic parenchymal lesion here if you change your focus site to the depth of the tumor. Field of view. So field of view, keep it big for screening, but for lesion characterization or procedure guidance, you want to make it small. So an error that is pretty common in juniors doing procedures is to get this big field of view, and then you can't see the needle as well, and you don't know what's going in. Zoom it in, make your field of view smaller, and focus on the targeted area of interest. Image optimization. So there's many factors for a given system. I'd read through this table, just becoming familiar with it. But there's grayscale curves. So different curves are assigned different values for any given echo intensity that's inherent to the machine. Line density is how many lines are acquired per transducer. Transducer dependent, obviously, but it can affect your resolution. So maybe a high frequency transducer, you want a lot of resolution, it'll have a lot of different arrays, a lot of lines of sight. Dynamic range, the range of signal strength that a given transducer can handle. So like there are some signals that just are too weak for a given transducer. So if you have a good dynamic range, that may enable a transducer to see weaker signals. Persistence is the frames that can be averaged to reduce noise. It doesn't work for moving things. So persistence would be a phenomenon where even though you move the transducer, there's a ghost of what you were just looking at. Obviously, that can be an artifact and an hindrance. All right. Oops. This is time to wake up! Wake up! This is a check, because I said this just, a couple minutes ago. The most likely frame rate in real-time ultrasound is, correct answer is 20. 20 to 30 is pretty commonly employed. So, that concludes our talk, and I thank you very much for participating.